everybody. Hello. This is wonderful. Looking forward to this interview. It is really an amazing biography by Professor Timothy Brennan from University of Minnesota. Wrote a lot of different books, several other books, and has access to the great intellectual Palestinian Arab figure. And everybody wants to be like Edward Said. Every Arab comes to America wants to be like Edward Said, knows Edward Said. He gave us the vocabulary that you articulate our stories, and it's the story about the South, the poor, that were orientalized by Europe and the West for years, and Said just broke it all open and exposed the hypocrisy of European intellectual and racist narrative of the East, and I think the Orientalism was a ground breaking thesis and serious analysis of how knowledge are acquired, or how knowledge, or the relationship between knowledge and power, and how the European went to the Middle East and with their pen and brushes and to draw an image of the Arabs as a very different groups, very different race, very different with different culture. They are backward, irrational, sex maniac, and demonizing them and degrading them to the point to rationalize and justify their colonial history, and those people needed the white man and the West to civilize them, and I think Orientalism exposes all of this, and by this intentionally, the Orientalists went to the Orient and kind of staged this image of the Arabs, and especially Arab women in Algeria, and and just kind of stage and studio images of them, not really related to the actual life of Arab women in the street or house. So he died in 2003, illness and cancer, but his legacy lives on, and this is a great biography here. I just got it a few days ago, and it's almost 500 pages, a lot of resources, a lot of access to file archives, family files. They trusted Professor Brennan's to take a look at those files and resources, and FBI files. He has access to all of that, and it took him years to write that biography. So stay with us, and we're going to be talking to Professor Brennan very, very shortly.
صار في شبابك عم بتزهر صار في ولاد وبإيديهم في كتاب وبلاقي الكل ولاد سال الحق بفيت البيوت والإيدين السودا خلعت الابواب وصارت البيوت بلا اصحاب وصارت البيوت بلا اصحاب.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Fine, great. Welcome. Thank you so much for giving us the time. You were yourself study under Edward Said.
I entered Columbia University Graduate School in 1980. So, right on the cusp. So this was, you remember that period. It was like the radical 1970s were coming to a
Exactly.
close. The Vietnam War had been over for about 5 years by that point. I entered the school naively. I only applied to one graduate program. I'd lived in New York for 2 or 3 years before that, doing political organizing in Latino neighborhoods. I wasn't your typical grad student in that way. I thought that Columbia was still alive with the fervor of the 1960s, and it was not that way at all. It was filled with people who had come from finishing schools, and it was, rife with East Coast snobbery from my point of view. When I entered there, I had heard from some people who knew much more than I that Edward was somebody that you wanted to maybe get to know. So I marched into his office, and expected to be welcomed with open arms. I was going to join his seminar, and apparently, you have to be invited in. You can't. But I think he liked the fact that I was a little rough and raw, and I wasn't the usual type, and that I'd done political organizing. He wanted to know all about it. What was life like on the street, that kind of thing. So I think he thought me kind of strange. Probably didn't take me seriously, but he did let me into his seminar. So it took a while, but we got to know one another. We recognized something in one another, and we became close, as much as a PhD advisor and advisee can become close. Um, I, I was there at a particular time. I mean, Orientalism, the book that really made his name internationally, had only been out for 2 years, and its effects had not fully been felt. So I knew him, in other words, right at the moment that he was breaking out and becoming who we all know him now to be. So I saw that process. It was a gradual process, and it was a very interesting process. And um, I think it was probably, in a political sense, his most radical period. I mean, he wrote a blistering attack on the university and the abdication of intellectuals who, in the humanities, should be public clarions, writing accessible works on the major issues of the day, and who were instead sort of buried in this arcane literary theory. And so that's the Edward I knew.
Yeah, I would like to thank you. I got the book. Your publisher sent it to me. I got it 2 days, so I've been reading it. I haven't slept ever since. So between Edward's autobiography, Out of Place, and your biography, Places of Mind, now I'm mixing both of them together. I'm out of mind. I mean, I just don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
So slowly we're gonna just swim through this because you throw at us a lot of things, and this is almost 440 pages. How long did it take you to write this? I mean, you got access to files or resources that were not public and are not available to any serious researcher. So my first question: how did his family trusted you to share with you all these personal files?
Well, it's a great question, and I have to speculate a little bit. I don't know the answers to all these things, but I do have a clear idea about some of it. So the first thing I guess I have to say is that I didn't think I was going to write this biography. I didn't go to publishers and demand to be heard, as it were, right? Because I had something to say. I got a call out of the blue from a New York literary agent who is very well known. His name's Andrew Wiley, and he manages a lot of the big writers, Martin Amis and Salman Rushdie, and Edward towards the end of his life. But and he calls me out of the blue. It's not every day you get a call from a New York literary agent, and he said that there was interest among commercial publishers in New York for an intellectual biography of Edward Said, and he had heard that I was the one to do it. Okay. So who he heard this from, I can only guess, but my guess is that people in Edward's family, his immediate family, were familiar with the things I had written on Edward. They'd seen me speak publicly on him, and apparently they liked what they heard. They trusted that I would tell his story in a way that conformed to how they thought about him. So we just happened to have that. So I think that's what happened. Now, when that happened, of course, a lot of people who were refusing over the years between his death and then to talk to any researchers because they didn't trust them, because they had bad experiences with some who wanted to defame Edward, and had gotten them to give them interviews and distorted what they had said. They opened up to me. And when they opened up to me, it wasn't just being available for interviews, but they also shared with me documents that aren't in any archive, right?
Yes.
So there was a lot of information that I had access to that other people didn't. There was also information that people technically do have access to, but it just takes a long time to go through it. You've got to be really committed. So the Edward Said papers are voluminous. They're unfortunately not very well organized. And so, you really have to spend a lot of time reading through that and separate the wheat from the chaff. And so you asked me how long. I guess, depending on how you count it, it was about 6 years. And probably 3 years or more of that was just gathering information. The files at Stanford University, where he wrote Orientalism, and I won't go down the list, but there's all these kinds of files.
It's all listed in the book, but
right, yeah. And then of course there's these student transcripts of his, right? Which you can't just go and ask for somebody's student transcripts. You've got to get an okay from the family. So that was where they trusted me enough to not distort the record, and I got to see all these things about Edward growing up and in school, and how his teachers saw him and what they were saying about him, and things like that.
Oh, and you didn't. I met Edward Said twice in the 80s, like you did, at the U during the anti-war and Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and so we were and at first time I see this idol. He was our idol. I mean, we don't really appreciate writer that much, and we were students. We don't appreciate professor or any intellectual, but he was a movie star. He was, it's not just a writer, that he mastered the language that we can communicate with the West. I think for any Arab and East, that's our guy. He just give us the vocabulary. And the second time he was ill in the 90s. It was very different Edward Said, but he was a fighter. So let's. I don't know how you organize that biography, and of course you go back and forth, and that kind of things. But for the sake of our audience here, and I don't want to lose half of them at the end of this interview, get too technical and academical. So let's start soft with his relationship with his family. Talk a little bit about his relationship with his dad. It wasn't really a very warm relationship. His dad was a businessman, after money, travel all the time. And then his relationship with his mother, she's really kind of the soft one, but was a controlling one, as you mentioned some of this. And then his sister, his wife. So let's start with his father. What kind of a father was he to Edward growing up?
Right. I think a lot of people who have already reviewed the book or read it have found this part of the biography that covers his childhood and up through his early schooling to be gripping for them, partly because I tell a different story than Edward tells himself. His only autobiographical writing has to do with his childhood. He stops by the time he gets to college, and so we don't know, in his own words, how he would have narrated the rest of his life. So that's new in my biography, but I'm also kind of countering some of the things that he said in his memoir. So if anyone is familiar with this memoir, and it is the most beautiful piece of writing, just purely as a piece of writing that I think Edward ever produced, out of place.
Wow.
It reads like a novel. It's a beautiful piece. That he wrote sort of in the early hours of the morning on the fly, as it were, right, over a 5 or 6 year period. He describes his relationship with his father as terribly vexed, as the father was an emotional illiterate. He was indifferent and cold, and He would never write him a truly personal letter. He would dictate it, to his secretary and sign it, yours truly, Wadia Saeed. This kind of thing is how Edward characterizes his father. I found that this is really not
Fascinating.
how the rest of the family saw it at all, that he was a smiling Santa Claus figure. He was emotional and tender, and he would stay up all night with the girls when they were ill. And, he, and there's documentary proof that sort of backs that up. I've found letters in the archive of Wadia, his father's, sending him personal letters in which he's kind of vulnerable and begging Edward for more I don't know, filial
Approval or something.
so it's really that's very different. Now, Edward, you've met him, and the people who've met him, paralleled writer who could communicate in popular venues very, very difficult ideas that had to do with his specialization in theory and the humanities. So he's that kind of person. But really, what made Edward the force, I think, that he was, had to do with his personal performance of himself. I mean, he was so charming and so good looking and so quick on his feet and always 100% on when he was there. And he knew things about people and was personal with them. He would ask them, he knew all the names of your significant others. And, he just was so wonderful to be around. He lights up a room whenever he walks in. So anybody who knows Edward knows this. So you wouldn't know, if you had met him and didn't know anything about his past, that he was tortured. He was troubled. He was driving himself constantly. And this is what his childhood was like. He was pampered. He was the only male, the oldest sibling, and the only male. I think it would be fair to say that he parlayed that position into a privilege that his sisters didn't enjoy. That
Didn't he say, I know I keep interrupt, I'm so excited about this, I keep interrupting because I have no memory. Whatever I remember, I'm going to throw it out before I forget it. So
Sure.
don't mind me. But didn't he say he felt like he is entrapped in his privilege?
I think he was the son of a businessman, and they lived in this beautiful island oasis, Zamalek in Cairo, which is an island actually right in the middle
Exactly,
of the river. And in the time that he lived there, it was filled with beautiful gardens and country clubs everywhere, right? And so he said he was safely, protected from the fellahin, So he's saying that with a note of self mockery. He feels guilty, I think, about this privilege, and he recognizes that he's, the title of my first chapter is The Cocoon. This is what he calls he's in. He's in a cocoon. And I thought that, in some ways that's an appropriate image because he's cut off from the real life that everyday people in Cairo live. But on the other hand, it isn't an appropriate image because cocoons are there to nurture, right, and protect. And,
yeah, you're right.
and whereas for him, this was premature adulthood. He thrust himself into the study of music, and he thrust himself into the study of books that were ones that somebody of his age wouldn't typically read, because he always sought out the company of people who were older than him. And this was a pattern that would remain for the rest of his life. He was always around people who were older than him, including some of his love entanglements. So I think that he was driven. He had parents that pushed him to be driven, but in addition to that, he internalized that, and he tortured himself with that.
I know other people say that he's always felt out of place, which is his autobiography title. But where is this insecurity coming from?
An inferiority complex, I think, is the way to answer it. I think that there's a number of psychological symptoms.
As an Arab or as an intellectual? I mean, what as?
I think that
personal.
his being in, if you want to interpret the phrase out of place in an ethnic or national way, and that would be one way to do so. I think that would be appropriate. That would be part of it. Mm-hmm. Yes, that of course exacerbated this feeling, but I think it's more that it's a question of his personality. he had a troubled personality, I think, which he freely admitted. I mean, he was, in therapy from the time that he was in college until the end. And I think that he is somebody who was very gifted at keeping from other people the consternation that was eating at him on the inside. I mean, one of the reasons he's on all the time, and one of the reasons that he can kind of translate what's going on inside of his stomach, into charm, has to do with his being restless, anxious, constantly searching, and ever unfulfilled. It was probably a psychological mechanism to force him to do more. He couldn't do more. He couldn't do enough for the Palestine cause. I mean, it's absolutely astounding for anybody who's taken the time to do it, to sit down and read the sheer volume of articles attacking from every different angle, sometimes using reminiscence, sometimes fiction, sometimes polemic, sometimes historical fact-finding. I mean,
drawing images.
Yeah, all these different genres, and he's constantly kind of reinventing the wheel for people who refuse to hear him, and it's so creative and so prolific. And you think, like, how could he have kept this up for so many decades? But it had to do with this inner drive, which I think he experienced as pain.
When the cab driver asked him, "Are you a Muslim?" he said, "Alhamdulillah." Very clever, and so he some people say he's done to Islam more than all the imams and sheikhs done in the whole world. So did he look at Islam as a victim of the West? What's his relationship with religion and then with Islam?
Well, okay, I think that he I think I say at one point in the biography that he and Elias Khoury, the Lebanese novelist, very well known, also a Christian, they describe themselves as honorary Muslims, right? Just yes. Because they've had a platform.
We offer this to some people.
Right. So there's that sort of tongue-in-cheek relationship that he establishes. But despite the fact that Edward was very, very clear throughout his career in saying that he wanted to abjure the sectarianism which certain forms that religious belief takes, has hurt and undermined possibilities in the Middle East as in the United States. So he popularized the idea of the secular intellectual, and then wanted to leave questions of religious belief to individuals. And he was very, very careful about not offending in matters of religion, and he was entirely in favor, of course, of people being followers of the religion of their choice. And so he also very proudly was an Anglican and read the Book of Common Prayer and grew up in a very religious household. And I think culturally that had an imprint on him. But when it comes to the role of Islam in the Middle East, right, he is very much affected, I think, influenced by two intellectuals, towering intellectuals who preceded him, and with whom he was related. And one of them is Charles Malik, the former, at one point, one of the most important Arab intellectuals of his day, who was a co-signatory of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the UN, was a UN General Secretary for a while, a very, very important man, but he was also somebody who studied philosophy, and Edward emulated him. Now, I'm bringing him up not just kind of to create a loose connection, but that it is Malik in his writings for like foreign policy journals in Washington, because he was very, very connected, who's making the point that you have to understand that Islam is, of course, it's a religion, but it's also kind of the cultural substrate of the entire region. Everyone, no matter what their religion is part of this worldview, and it's deep in the grain of the society. And so one who is from that region understands this and wants to, express the glorious past of this and articulate its importance today. So that's one figure who made that kind of argument, and then a figure who's really kind of very different politically and personally and so on, but also a Christian, like Malik was, and that's Konstantin Zurek, right?
Yeah.
Who coined the term, the disaster, right, for the Nakba, for the establishment of Israel in 1948. So he is somebody that he's related to, sees him all the time, and he says this very same point. And I think that was something that deeply affected Edward.
He mentioned a few times that he is the last Jewish intellectual, and he was critical of Jewish intellectual, of course. When it comes to Israel, they cave in and they're not honest about their intellectual integrity with questions. So what does he mean by, he was saying, most of Jewish intellectuals are suburban squirrel. I mean, and maybe people will jump on this, oh, anti-Semitic, that's a very bad image. But he...
Well, I think that, he's trying to make the case that there's a great deal of anti-Semitism that's delivered these days against people who are, a different kind of Semite, right?
Yeah.
Who are Arab, who are
Arabs,
from
yeah.
the Middle East. This is the anti-Semitism of our day. And so many of the Jewish intellectuals with whom he, debated or talked on the same platform with, would, because of their interest in defending the state of Israel, want to kind of forget the past, right? Let's let bygones be bygones. Now this is what it is. It's the new regime, and let's just forget all those things. And he's saying, look, think of the traditions of the Jewish dissident intellectuals. Baruch Spinoza, would be an example of this. Leon Trotsky.
Yeah.
And then the one that he probably had foremost in his head would be Theodor Adorno, who is a Marxist intellectual, a critic of mass culture, a brilliant music critic who, used his knowledge of the philosopher Hegel and of Marx in order to mount this wonderfully blistering and uncompromising critique of contemporary capitalism. So he's saying this is the tradition that I'm identifying with. What are you doing? You're an apologist for power. You're like a champion of the strong, right? Whereas I'm really kind of carrying on the very thing that these Jewish intellectuals that we all associate with this wonderful strain of Jewish intellectual life have carried on in the past, and I'm doing that, not you.
I mean, Edward wears so many hats, and from a musician, he was a accomplished pianist. He was a writer. He was a novelist. Who wrote novels, stories. He was with the PLO. He was Sharon Holder. You say with power. It was Yasser Arafat. It was PLO negotiate. I mean, how could you navigate yourself, even intellectually, through all this that require freedom and intellectual freedom and openness, and then practicality of politics, which require compromising and being realist? How can you reconcile all of this?
It's mind-boggling. I mean, it really is. And I know the word genius is overused, but I always felt that he was the one person in my life that I'd met who was a genius. And by that I mean that he was able to turn very, very complex ideas into something that was directly communicable to others, that he would be confronted by an array of possible choices of action and would invariably choose the right one. He had a sense of timing, which I think is very important. When you're doing all of these different things, you have to know how much time to spend on what and what not. And then, where did he have the time to read? And really, how is it that he could write essays that people are still reading, that are still being translated, that he wrote in basically 3 days? Now, I don't know about other people, but it takes me a lot longer than 3 days to write an essay. So
it took you 6 years to write this.
So this is partly the answer to your question, is that he had this amazing ability to compartmentalize on the one hand. He understood something very important, which a lot of intellectuals don't, and that is to be heard and to be given certain venues, certain opportunities for being heard, has a lot to do with being a people person and being on the phone with people and talking to people and making connections between people and bringing people who don't know one another together and constantly making whoever you're talking to feel like they're your personal confidant and no one else, right? So, I knew him really well. I was personal friends with him, but I'm one of, I don't know, thousands, I
Yeah,
suppose.
yeah, yeah. Well,
So that
yeah.
this is it. I mean, but when you think about it for a minute, I mean, this is what there are many surprises I found while writing this thing, but one of them was the sheer number of demands made on his time every single day that he turned on his computer or had his secretaries open his mail. I mean, it's unbelievable. Every single day, there are 20 things from all around the world asking for a piece of him. And to be able to still think at all, much less write books in such an atmosphere is.
In the Guardian piece about your biography, the things I found it, was a discovery for me is his attitude toward fiction, and he really, as he might say this in public, I need a critic, not a poet, and but he himself, he was writing novels, he was in music, he was writing poetry. Was he a closet fictionist or?
I think he aspired to write fiction, and it's my judgment that he wrote very good fiction, and that he could have written a very, very fine novel had he seen it through. And I think he didn't see it through for different reasons that had to do with things that were happening in his life. As much as I appreciate that coverage in The Guardian, I think that Donna Ferguson, who wrote that, didn't either understand what I was telling her in the interview or wanted a sexy angle, that's kind of outrageous.
Journalism for you.
To get people's attention. Because I think one of the words that she uses, and it's nothing that I ever told her, that he had contempt for the novel.
Yes, that was very surprised to me.
That's most untrue. That's not true of Edward Hatch. So, he taught novels for a living. I mean, he loved novels. He constantly was illustrating his political work with references to novels and poetry. So that isn't really the issue. The issue is a different one, and that is that he... If I could just give you two little anecdotes. One of them is that one of these novels that he attempted was when he was much younger. It was between college and graduate school. He began it, and he went back to Cairo for a year to work in his father's business, in part to help his father, who was having health problems, but partly also to give a chance to his great aunt's desire that he follow Wadie, his father, in the business. So he went back to see whether this is something he wanted to do. So it's during that year, among other things, that he's writing this novel, which is set in Cairo. And I think that he aspired to it, and he loved the idea that he would have this capacity to write it. But the only reason he didn't finish it is when he went back to begin graduate school at Harvard. His studies overwhelmed him, and he decided to dedicate himself to that. That was really the first clear indication that he was going to be a professor of literature. He was going to be a musician, or he was going to be a doctor, or he was going to be a medical businessman of some sort in the Middle East. This is what he aspired to.
This is what the parents probably expected of him anyway.
Right. So that's one thing. The other thing then is later in his life, when he goes through a long hiatus after writing Orientalism and doesn't really write a book, just collections of essays, he expresses himself at one point rather artistically and poetically in one of his books in the form of a photo text montage, collage, based on some photo text works of people he admired, like John Berger. And it was called After the Last Sky, which enlists the wonderful photographs of Palestinians in the occupied territories by Jean Moore, a famous photographer. And then he writes these very subjective, very, very emotional, poetically written responses to the photographs. They're not meant to describe what's in the photographs. They're not meant to describe something that's on the ground. They're kind of fictional. And this is, he saw, I think, at this point in his career, that particular mode in which to express oneself had certain features that were important and inviting, that would perhaps get across to people something that he couldn't get across in his essays or in his theoretical articles or books. So he thought this was another reason to pick it up. So now he's writing the second novel, and it's set in Beirut, and it's all about betrayal, and it's really it's filled with beautiful writing, really good writing. I mean, he could have done this, but I think that at a certain point he realized that the story he really wanted to tell was the one that he was best positioned to tell, which had to do with his own particular life and situation. And so he turns to the memoir instead, and kind of playfully refers to it as a fictional autobiography. So he's sort of,
Yeah, it's a mix usually.
trying to square the circle, as it were. But here's the last thing I'll say, and I think it's maybe the most important thing, and it's the thing that I was trying to get across to Donna Ferguson at The Guardian and apparently failed. And that is, he didn't stop writing the novel because he wasn't up to it, because he wasn't good enough. And he certainly didn't turn on fiction per se and dismiss it all because he, out of rancor or resentment, thought it was no good simply because he couldn't do it, which is, I think, what is implied in that article. It's more that he said, look, we live in a society that on the one hand is, filled with, honorific titles for scientists and technicians. And on the other hand, if it comes to the humanities, the only people who get the microphone and the only people that are paid attention to are novelists. He goes, what about the intellectuals? The critical intellectuals have a role that's much more important. They're not just commentators on the primary work, which is the fiction produced by novelists or poets. It's that they are the ones who are really better poised to offer an analysis of the world in which we live that is of use to people. And that's the point he wanted to make. He said, I am an intellectual, and that's why I'm not going to be a novelist. I want to hold up this image.
Move to his 3 books, trilogy, start with the Orientalism, which really it was a groundbreak. I mean, he was not the first one talk about how the European or the West is Orient. But the European were trying to portray the Arabs, especially in Algeria and the relationship with French, as a extreme different. And they have extreme different culture and extreme different mindset, backward, anti-reasoning and sex.
Orientalism, as he defines it, of course, has to do with representations by French and English philologists, that is, students of literature, literary texts from the 19th and 20th centuries, and their representation of the Orient, which they would have understood not as the Far East, not China and Japan and India even, but the Middle East is what they meant at that time by the word Orient. And there's something about the proximity of the Orient geographically that is important here to him, that because it was a region that was so easy to access, even in the 19th century, because of the flow of the arts and sciences and information out of the Arab world into Europe, helping to inform Europe, because Greece, and the wonders of ancient Greece depended a lot on the theology of the Egyptians and the work of the Phoenicians. There's a kind of a deep-seated worry on the part of Europe that to establish its own uniqueness, right, and to find its way of saying that the place called the Orient is inferior and locked in its own past, and therefore needing of correction, which of course the Europeans were only too happy to provide, that there had to be an artificial creation of difference and otherness. So in other words, it's paradoxical, but precisely because the Middle East is close, it has to be made to be far away. I think that's partly what he's trying to say. And he's looking at the fantastical projections about the peoples of, the Islamic world and the Arab world that can be found in these philologists who are called Orientalists, who would even call themselves Orientalists as a sort of mark of distinction. It's their specialization. That these people were not at all consistently showing Islam and the Middle East as being filled with lecherous men and harems. It's not demeaning in every respect. There, of course, are those images, and that's part of what goes on in Orientalism. Some of it was like euphoric and absolutely over the top in its praise. But what was true about both poles of representation is that they wanted to imprison the Arab and Islamic worlds in the texts of their own past, right? The only thing that was important about them were these great works of the past. So on the one hand, they were made to have an entirely textual reality, right? They were
Staged.
one of the things that was real about them could be found in these books, and the other one is that they're stagnant, right? There's nothing about the contemporary moment that is of any interest. So what the Orientalists are not doing is looking at people right next door as having the same problems that Europeans have, and are going about the same kinds of things. That's
what a concept.
Yeah, right. So this is, I think, what is going on now. You're right to say that a lot of people, of course, wrote about this problem of the misrepresentation, false representations, and so on. But I think there's two things that make his book different, and it's why the book took off. Okay, one of them is that he's far from merely condemning. He really admires the learning and the linguistic, talents and capacities, and the sheer doggedness of the research that these people did, and their ability to turn it into this complex synthesis, this body of knowledge. I mean, he's just in awe. And he's very often praising, and people forget this, he's praising the Orientalists. He's saying, we need to learn how they did this. How did they make an obscure discipline of the humanities important enough to affect public policy? This is something I want to learn. And I think he's apprenticing himself to it. And one of the reasons the book took off is because he learned how they did it and got it across. So that's one thing. The other thing is that he is really allowing us to see a theoretical problem. I know this makes people turn off immediately. Oh, no, I don't want to hear about literary theory. But for him, and this is why I think it's important to understand Edwards' relationship to literary theory. It can be explained, and I think I do, but hopefully other people think so too. It can be explained in everyday terms. But basically, he is trying to say that the kind of misrepresentation of our world that we find in the contemporary media of the United States, which brings onto these television programs these pundits, these experts, who are sitting there telling us, oh yes, well, how it is, the psychic character of the Arab terrorist, it's very, very, it has to do with, and then there's some sort of psychological...
like Arab Mind.
The Arab Mind, right? Yeah. The Arab Mind kind of book and idea. And so he's trying to say, there's a history to this. And it's something that people who study literature for a living, if you don't mind my saying so, he's saying to people, they have a special take on. And that is the problem of representation, right? That when we communicate with one another, we're not actually imparting what is in our minds whole and clear to someone else. There's a medium, and that medium is language, and it's books and ideas. And that medium, that two-step process, right, that involves a kind of middle ground, that's the problem in literary studies known as representation. And that is what he is giving this remarkably nuanced, historically well-researched account of. And so many of the people who hated Orientalism, the Orientalists who attack it on grounds that have nothing to do with his intentions and don't understand anything else about the rest of his work, they don't get this. And so they consequently misread the book.
Just in his book, The Question of Palestine, he was making the argument we need to do the same thing that Zionism did. We need to have a narrative that brings all the Palestinians together. And he was not taken by, as you said in the book, by being the narrative of the weak Palestinian, that they've been bombed, they've been displaced, they're refugee all their life. He said, that's a strength.
Yeah, that's a strength. Yeah, he gives it a name. He calls it Palestinianism, and maybe it's not the best name, but what he's getting at is that the constant displacement, the diasporic wandering forced on them, the contempt that Palestinian people, even before the Nakba, right, of 1948, had for the borders set up by the imperial powers, right. This is an experience and a frame of mind that is based on inclusion, right? Inclusion. And the greatest contrast could be found between Zionism as an ideology and Palestinianism on this ground, right? That Zionism is about exclusion. It's very, very frank about that. And so he's trying to say it's of course a tragedy that Palestine has not been able to establish a state of its own with its own sovereignty. And that is the goal, rest assured. But the fact of the matter is that this experience has allowed them to understand something about the limits of nationalism and the limits of holding up one place that you create as a sacred ground, and is forced something on them that we can learn from, and that they, in their literature and poetry and so on, are communicating to us. And this is a very, very important positive contribution that's coming from the Palestinian people. Yeah.
The last chapter, Race for Time, it brought tears in my eyes, and it was a lot of details. And as somebody himself watched my best friend and my brother-in-law going through the same illness and making decisions about should he live or not, and being in that emergency room and looking at the monitor. And he himself was looking at the monitor and watching his heart, his sister, his family. You really brought me into that room, and it brought tears in my eyes. And I think I just, it deserves some reading, if you don't mind, about, and I'm going to just, I hope I don't destroy this, because it's beautiful. It's really, you just boring.
وصار في بيوت وصار في شبابيك عم بتزهر صار في ولاد وبإيديهن في كتاب وبلاقي الكنونات.
There is simple black marble. You describe in the grave there, slab, breasted, his name appearing in English above and in Arabic below. Like the cemetery itself, the plot is tucked away from the wall. Triangle of the graveyard, which, although small, is too large for the number of Quakers buried there. And although it faces south toward Palestine, overlooking a mountain range towering above Beirut, even the final resting place was not quite right. He was always in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it's just, you finish it beautifully, and his life tragically or methodically representing his life. So when you write those things, when you probably there in describing, as somebody spent 6 years researching this, how you separate between you as a serious researcher and that poetic way of describing Saeed's life or death?
I'm not sure I know how to answer that. It to me, just my perception is that those two things are intertwined. It is, of course, difficult to write about somebody because on the one hand, you admire somebody a great deal, but you also have to tell things about them that are not always flattering, and there are things to say that are not always flattering. Sometimes this has to do with elements of his personality, vanity and impatience with students and the other things. But there's, the fact of the matter is that there is the record that needs to be told, and it needs to be told as much as possible within its entirety. You cannot separate entirely the fact that you knew the person as a person in the world. And I think that part of the job of a biographer who's in such a situation is, without pulling back from the bad news, which at times isn't about personality, it has to do with disagreements you have with things that he's written, and or failings that you think are there in some of the scholarship despite all of the achievement. And I think I do get into that and mention those things, but I need to evoke the kind of person he was in the world and the effect that I think most people might have in this particular case, seeing this particular graveyard in Brumana, Lebanon, which is on the side of a hill, and it's quite remarkable for being tucked away and not noticeable, and it's totally unfitting in so many ways for the kind of person he was and who his connections were. The sad fact that he couldn't choose to be buried in Palestine, which he would have, of course, preferred, but because of the possible desecration of his grave, wisely, in my opinion, decided not to do. But in this case, I also wanted to point to something. As subjective as it might appear, I wanted to point to something that is objectively related to his own life, with the final words of the biography, which is not quite right, because I think people should know that that was the name, the title that he had for his memoir. All the way right up until it went to press, he always was calling it Not Quite Right. And I think that's important because, out of place is evocative in many ways, but it does turn us more into the direction of that place, which is always on his mind. Palestine is this a state of Palestine that he wanted very much to get realized. And so out of place means he's not in that place. He's in some other place. So the idea of exile is sort of like what that conjures. Not quite right, however, is a phrase that is a little different. It means that you're out of sorts, not just in a geographic sense, or not just in a sense of your identity, as a Palestinian, but you're not quite right in other ways. You're always feeling inadequate to the situation.
Inadequate.
Unfinished. You need to prove yourself yet again. You need to do more. Things are unresolved. That's him. That's him. And so, not quite right is, in this sense, the right phrase for his life, one that he chose, and that I thought this burial place sort of dramatically represents.
Thank you so much, Professor Brennan. It's a great book, A Life of Edward Said, Places of Mind. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You too. All right.
يا عيني عليك تخطر يا مليك وانا بين ايديك انت امرني في الحال اضيع اسرح واضيع شارك وتبيع وما عندي خيار ويلي من حبك دوتني حبك غدار قلبك يا حبيبي في المية وقلب النار ويلي من حبك دوتني حبك غدار قلبك يا حبيبي في المية وقلب النار تقلب يا حبيبي ارحم يا رفيق هايب في طريق ما توصلني لو كنت طليق قلبي غريب في بحر عميق ما في له قرار